I hope each of you is enjoying the NAPABA Convention virtual experience so far. A reminder, please share your experiences with everyone on social media using hashtag NAPABA20. I am pleased to introduce our keynote series speaker, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who has had a long history of public service and has served on our highest court for over 26 years. A prolific writer, he has penned and edited numerous books and articles, including his most recent book, The Court and the World. A former law clerk for Justice Arthur Goldberg, Justice Breyer will be interviewed by his former law clerk and NAPABA member, Judge Vince Chhabria, from the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California. Please join me in welcoming Justice Breyer and Judge Chhabria.
Thank you, Justice, for joining us at our convention. When I first went to the NAPABA convention, I think there were only a couple of hundred people there. And last year we had well over 2,000.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I mean, that's great that it's become so popular.
Yeah, and hopefully even more people now that it's virtual will get an opportunity to hear from you. So let me just start by asking, what have you been up to during the pandemic? What have you been doing with yourself?
Well, we've basically been staying up here in Cambridge. We have a house up in Cambridge, so it's Joanna and me and our three grandchildren, Eli, 14, and Angela and Sam, twins at 10, and Nell, their mother, and an au pair is very nice, and here we are.
So does that
sometimes we've gone up to, we have a cabin up in New Hampshire, and we've been up there most of the summer.
Does that mean that you are involved in distance learning?
Yeah. But what have I been learning? Mostly how to cook. That's the primary thing.
What about the kids? Are you teaching them history?
Yes, no, well, you think they'll listen to me? I mean, the schools are like 1 week on with half the class and masks and everything, and then 1 week of distant learning now. But we came up on March 8th. We really haven't been back there except for this rather sad memorial for Ruth. And but we really haven't. We've been up here since March 8th. And the kids are getting used to it. And actually, we trade off the cooking and we try to keep the chaos from taking over the house. And there we are. Now, a certain amount of work to do right now. And it's quite a lot, actually.
Well, I would think the grandkids are pretty lucky to have a Supreme Court justice helping with their distance learning.
Would you mind telling them that?
You mentioned Justice Ginsberg, and I've seen you comment publicly about her loss a couple of times, and I know that you two had a strong friendship. And one of the things you have mentioned about her recently since her passing is her comfort with silence.
I said that. Yes, that's true. Right.
Yeah, I was just curious to hear a little bit more about that and how somebody like that would be able to effectively operate in the court.
No, it's fine. It isn't that she didn't speak. She thought before she spoke. That's something that's a bit foreign to some of us. But Joanna, my wife, says, well, Stephen, you talk, and maybe you think while you're talking, but she also told me, not every silence needs to be filled. That's something that I've had a harder time learning. And Ruth didn't have a hard time with that. So if you're sitting next to her at dinner, she'd be a very interesting dinner companion, but she might not engage in a lot of chit chat. That's all right. As you got to know her, the more you liked her. I mean, that was the kind of person she was. She just, as over the years, you got to like her more and more. Very decent person. She paid a lot of attention to human relations and a lot of attention to detail, and that was true of her opinions too.
I think about oral argument at the court, maybe not now on the phone, but when it's in person. You think about the concept of silence. There's very little silence during Supreme Court argument. It's more like a cacophony.
Yes.
Somebody like her, how was she able to be effective in.
Oh, she
in
was.
oral argument.
She got her questions in. She decided what she wanted to ask, and she asked it. And she was very effective. I mean, that was no problem. Now we're doing this by telephone, and it has some pluses, it has some minuses. The pluses are each of us has to listen more carefully than I think was more norm to what the lawyers are saying and to what each other is saying. And the negative is it's hard to carry on a conversation. You just are going to ask one or two questions, and you can't go back and forth very easily with the lawyer, which is a pity, because I think that sometimes the oral argument works best when you get the lawyer really engaged in a conversation on some difficult matter of law. And they'll begin to say what they think, not just what is in the client's interest. I know that seems very unusual, but it's very helpful to us because they know a lot about the subject. And
you think it's less likely that they will do that in the current format because it's sort of more formal and regimented?
Yes. Yes. On the other hand, the current format is very fair to everybody on the court and the lawyers, and they get a fair chance to ask their questions. And also, it's a little more tiring, but it's a little more worthwhile in the sense that you listen pretty carefully to what the other judges and the lawyers are saying.
I was listening to one argument recently, and one observation I had was that normally you all are talking to each other quite a bit in your questions to the lawyers, right? You're having a conversation with one another, and in the current format, it kind of seems like each justice comes in with their line of questioning that they're planning on pursuing, and they pursue it, and it's less responsive to questions that the other justices maybe have asked. Have you noticed that?
True. That's true. I mean, there are different kinds of questions at oral argument. The best kind is, I don't know the answer to the question that I'm about to ask. I actually don't know. And it's, I think, important to the case. And I think the lawyer knows more about that question than I do. And it will advance the argument in my mind. Now, Clarence Thomas thinks that's the null set. Or he did think that if there are such questions, which there are occasionally, somebody else is going to ask them. No, he asks a lot more questions when it's a more orderly process, and that's very good. That's very good. Another kind of question is, as you say, you ask a question so your colleagues can see where you're coming from, and I can learn where they're coming from. And then there might be some back and forth, but it's helpful to know where they're coming from, because then you think about the kinds of arguments that are directly related to that. And then there's the kind of question that you just try to talk to hear yourself talk. That is not a good idea. That should be very minimal.
You have a reputation as someone who asks some pretty difficult multi-part questions that require multi-part answers. It strikes me that perhaps you're more likely to get the lawyer to answer your question when you're one-on-one with them, instead of other justices having an opportunity to jump in the middle of the lawyer's answer. Have you found that?
Don't know. And I don't know if the questions I ask are really the best asked in the Supreme Court. In a court of appeals, there are three people, and it's easier to advance the argument with three judges. When we would have an en-banc hearing and there'd be 9 people or 8 people, oh my gosh, try to get 8 people to agree where to go to lunch. It's very hard. And but I probably have picked up the habit of trying to answer, as I said, a question that I don't know the answer to. Or I think it is really a very good point that the other side raised. So I want to hear your answer to what I think is a good point of theirs. And since I think we all read the briefs and we discuss them with our clerks and they write memos, on the most obvious arguments, we're pretty much up to speed on what they say. So it will be a little esoteric sometimes. And sometimes I've asked questions that later on I regretted because I do ask what comes into my head. And we hope it's related to the argument, and almost always it is.
Well, all the lawyers can ask is for transparency, and that's one of the things that they've always gotten from you. One other thing that I saw in the papers recently about a public appearance of yours, people are fretting a lot, of course, these days about our democracy and the future of our democracy. And I saw a headline which described you as responding to those people. Look, stop complaining and start participating. Our convention, it's there. People of all ages and people of all different types of lawyers at our convention, but it's a largely young convention, and it's there are a lot of lawyers, young lawyers who work at law firms. And keeping in mind that audience, what do you mean? What are you thinking when you say start participating? What would you like to see?
It works best, perhaps, that particular point when I'm talking to a graduating class. What I'll tell them after I congratulate their grandparents, whom I point out their grandparents are the only people who think everything they do is marvelous. and that's true. And then I'll say, I can't tell you what to do with your life. I hope you find someone to love. I hope that you have a satisfactory job. And I hope that you participate in public life. And they're the last I can say something because I work with the Constitution. I'll show them the document. And I'll say, this is an extraordinary document. We can go into it later, how I believe it's held the country together. 320 million people of every race, religion, point of view. My goodness. And it's kept us or helped keep us together. So I say, by the way, it's not the Supreme Court under this document that tells you what to do. You are the ones who decide what kind of cities, towns, communities you want. And you can only do that by participating, by voting, by being on a library board, by being on a school board, by helping build better housing in the city, by working with neighborhood groups. I mean, there are dozens of things. And I'm not saying which one, but I'm hoping you'll do some. And the reason why is I'm reasonably certain that if you do not participate, this document, which I usually have a copy of the Constitution, I'll say it won't work. And I'm pretty sure John Adams and James Madison would support me in that. And what does that mean? It means, one, you're educated in how our government works. So you understand what I or somebody else are talking about when we say you are part of that government. That is a government that depends upon you. And then I think the participation, it's the education, the participation, and it could be cities, it could be states, it could be national politics. It is at least when you have a different view. You politely, I hope, explain it to somebody else who doesn't hold your view. And you talk about it. That's called the First Amendment. You talk about it. It's called free speech and free press. And you get into a discussion. And maybe you'll convince them, or maybe they'll convince you. Who knows? Or maybe you'll reach some middle grounds. But if you do not participate, it won't work. And by the way, it requires practice. Practice, why? Because when you're working there with a group of other people, particularly if the people don't share your point of view on many things, if you're working there, you better have practice with compromise and practice with cooperation. So I always like to think back to when I was in the 5th grade at Grant School in San Francisco, and my teacher, who was then, I think, Miss Squataguatza, and she had one session where what we did was we had to write about San Francisco's history or something, or how the city was, something about the city, but she divided us into groups of 4 or 5 people, and each group got 1 grade for the whole group. All right? That's how people cooperate. Yeah, that's what we used to be good at, this country. Pragmatic, cooperation, think of new ideas, don't get wedded down, listen to what the other person says. He'll eventually, he's going to say something you agree with, then you say, let's work with that. And you see how far you can get. And my God, that used to be anyway, a sign, a characteristic, a major attribute of this country. So good, we can do it. We can do
You
it.
said you made you used a phrase. It used to be anyway. Do I take from that phrase that you think it's particularly important now
Mhm.
for people to sort of?
Yeah, I do. But where that
participate?
phrase, yeah. I mean, that phrase comes from my time working for Senator Kennedy. I mean, my God, he showed us and he told us. He said, when you have a project and say some of the Republican senators don't agree, you sit down with their staff and get them to talk. And the more they talk, the more you're likely to find something you agree with. And when you do, you say, let's work with that. Okay? And very often you could get agreement. Very often it might not be perfect, but he'd say, take 40%, take 30%, rather than being the hero of your group when they realize you did nothing. You see? That's why I don't like dissents. It means they're a failure. A dissent is a failure. And so try. And by the way, he used to add, do not worry. Maybe it was you that gave me the mug. I can't remember. But I got a mug from one group of my clerks with all the Senator Kennedy sayings on it. And one of them is, don't worry about credit. There's plenty of credit to go around if it's a success. And if it's a failure, who wants credit? And I cannot tell you how many times I saw him. It's a weapon, he said, giving credit to people, brings them along. So something would succeed, and there would be a press conference. And he wouldn't push himself out in front. He'd say to the press, Senator Hatch was so helpful on this. And he'd point out what Senator Hatch had done, which was something. And then the credit would go not simply to him. It would go to other people. Good. That's just a sort of gimmick, but it's very worthwhile. And working with credit, working with other people. Why now? Because people tell me I'm not working on the Senate staff anymore. And they tell me it's changed a lot. Well, that's a pity. Like most of the things that you worked in, Vince, they were perfect when you worked there. That's how we feel about it.
Right, back in my day. So
Yeah,
I guess,
of course.
it's funny. We are recording this before the election, and it's going to air at the convention right after the election. I assume you would say that this premium that we need to place on participation in our system, improving our democracy, restoring our democracy, however you want to characterize it, that premium exists regardless of what happens in the election.
Certainly, I think so. If I really want to be mean about it, I read in Derek Bach's book about education, I don't know if this is true, but he said that Pericles, the great Greek leader of Athens, at the great funeral oration, which was so famous in 300 or whatever it was BC, I don't remember. What is an Athenian? What is our democracy, he said. And as part of that, he said, well, what do we say in Athens about a person who does not participate? We do not say there is a man who minds his own business. We say there is a man who has no business here. Pretty tough. I mean,
you've mentioned
that's true.
You've mentioned school a couple of times in San Francisco, and of course this is where you grew up, and you come from a family of public servants. Your grandfather was a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Your father was the general counsel for the San Francisco Unified School District, and as a matter of fact, the boardroom there, the school boardroom, is named the Irving G. Breyer boardroom. Is the stuff you're talking about now, participation and participation in local government? I mean, does a lot of that come from your family background and watching family members in action?
It could be. My dad's first job was with the city attorney, Dion Home, which is where you worked, and you worked at a different city attorney. Same thing. I have his watch. I kept his watch. It says when he died, it says on the back, Irving G. Breyer, SFUSD, that's the San Francisco Unified School District, 1973. Then it started in 1933 to 1973. There we are. So maybe that was the way I grew up. And my mother was involved. It was a different time, but she was involved in the League of Women Voters, and she would get involved in political campaigns. And so it's true, it was a family that put a high premium on community, working in community and contributing something to the place where you live. I mean, you have inherited a lot from them. And what about spending these few short years of your life giving something back?
I do want to ask you about one of your opinions. We had a law clerk reunion last year to celebrate your 25th year on the Supreme Court bench. My co-clerk Risa Goluboff, who's now the dean of UVA, spoke, and she mentioned a number of your opinions. And each time she mentioned one of your opinions, there was a different level of applause from the audience. And but I think that the opinion that got the most applause, probably by far, was your dissent in the parents involved in Seattle schools case from about 13 years ago. Risa, by the way, would disagree with your statement that a dissent is a failure. And she spoke of how that opinion and several of your other dissents will be influential for years to come. But I've been thinking about the parents involved case recently because of the dialogue that we've had recently about race. And just for the audience, I'll very briefly summarize the case. This was a case about school districts using race, taking race into account in sort of a minor way in the process of assigning schools to kids to particular schools. And it was part of their effort to reduce or eliminate racial isolation in the schools. And this was challenged, and it went up to your court, and the plurality opinion in that case 13 years ago took the view that you can never use race at all in deciding how to assign kids to schools. And you wrote a very lengthy and passionate dissent, sort of explaining the difference between using race to segregate and using race to alleviate racial isolation, and how important it was for school districts to have this tool at their disposal, among many other tools, to eliminate racial isolation. As I said, that got sort of the greatest applause at our reunion, and it's obvious from reading the dissent that you felt particularly strongly about that issue. And I want to ask you why.
Well, one thing, as I said, that I see every single day is this Constitution, and I work with that, that's the primary document, which started out in the nation about 4 or 5 million people, I guess, is now helping to hold together a nation of 330 million people. And those 330 million people are every race, every religion, every point of view. And of course, they have to be treated with equal respect by the law. I mean, that's the point, if you're going to get those people to work and live together. Now, we have a problem beyond belief in this country. And that's what Tocqueville said. He admired many things about America, many things. But he said they have two problems. One is called the Indian tribes. He said, but that won't be a problem, they'll kill them all. He says that. There was some truth to that, unfortunately. And slavery. He says, I don't know how they're going to get out of that. And that was a nightmare. We read not too long ago. I mean, I can go on this. Frederick Douglass. It's really worth reading all 3 biographies, and you will get a picture. Or go to the African American Museum and see with your eyes what that was like. Okay? So it's very hard to get over something that's embedded in a culture for a couple of 100 years. And it doesn't happen overnight. And then we had, after that, Jim Crow. And it wasn't until 1954 that we began to get rid of that. And we began to move towards integration. And it isn't just Earl Warren in the court. It was Martin Luther King, and it was the Freedom Riders, and it was everybody under the sun that began to wake up to this and say, let's do something about it. And of course, it wasn't going to be cured overnight. And it took a long time to get rid of the legal part. And there are plenty of parts remaining. And so how does that relate to this opinion? Because what I feel pretty strongly about is I don't have the answer. I know what we're trying to do, trying to get people to treat other people as individual human beings, judge them on the merits, period. And I can't say that as well as Frederick Douglass said it, but I can think it. And I can think Erwin Griswold, who was dean of Harvard Law School, so you got me started on this, and I don't stop, really. Problem, when he was dean of Harvard Law School, a lot of things, he wasn't too popular, but one thing I liked, what I read, because it is, at a certain age when I grew up in San Francisco, you began to learn about prejudice. You began to learn that there was segregation in the South and that things were far from perfect in the North. And Griswold said to a Senate committee, when he first found that out, these are Griswold's kinds of words, he said, I burned, he said. I burned. Yeah, I thought, yeah, I can understand that. I can understand that. And so how does that tie into the opinion? I'm saying, look, this is a really tough problem. And by the way, let's let people leeway, give them leeway as long as they're working positively on the problem and not negatively. And eventually we will overcome that problem, not to be too trite, but I mean, who knows the best way to do it. But we do know that it is pretty important to try some way to do it. And so where you look at the purpose of the 14th Amendment and say that was to bring people together and treat them with equality, not to drive them apart and treat them as if they're some are inferior than others, of course that's what it was about. So that gives you leeway. And the leeway, Mr. School Board, Mr. in Seattle, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Citizen of whatever city and state, you use that leeway to help bring people together and treat people equally as citizens. Hey, the Supreme Court should not stand in your way. I don't know if that's what I said in that opinion, but I think that was the kind of theme.
And I wonder, I'm guessing that this is probably not something you're going to want to comment on. So I'm going to make it a little bit more of a comment than a question. But, you think about what's been happening this year on race. And, I think back to your opinion and a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is, the problem that the communities were trying to deal with in the Seattle schools case was racial isolation in the schools. Black kids largely going to school with each other, white kids largely going to school with each other as a result of racially segregated housing patterns. And thinking about what's happened this year, if you have a police officer who's growing up in a almost exclusively white community and going to school with, in a racially isolated environment, how can they become prepared to, interact with, the larger community as a police officer? And I wonder if, this sort of awakening that we are in the process of having this year will, might cause people to think differently about your opinion 13 years ago.
I don't know about my opinion, but I do know about the attitude, which I don't know how widely it's shared, but I know where I'd like to get. Not everybody. I mean, I'd like to get. When I'll give you the example. I'll give you two examples. When I was confirmed, I was walking along with Senator Kennedy at Logan Airport, and a Jewish newspaper reporter came up, and she said, how do you feel about two Jews being on the Supreme Court? And Kennedy sort of leaned over, God, this is going to be a political question. Would I say something that made sense? And he thought I did, and I said what I thought, which is fine. Fine. Just like that, you see? Of course, there are differences of race, religion, all kinds of differences among people, but those aren't the things that are going to make a difference in human relations, and certainly not in government relations with people, you see? And so I would like, fine. so a person's an African American. Fine, of course, yeah, you know that. But I mean, that's so what? So what? And anything short of that is what I rather liked years ago when I saw on television when there was apartheid in South Africa. They had some program on it, and there was a woman, a businesswoman, obviously, a Black woman, and they asked her, well, what do you think of apartheid? And what she said, living here with that, this isn't a normal country. Quite right. This is ridiculous. I mean, this is not a normal place. And when people begin to understand it's not a normal thing to do, to discriminate on racial grounds or other irrelevant things, when they decide that that isn't normal, at that point, it disappears. Good. So it's not that I can see where I want to go. I can see that it's going to take far more. I can't do much to influence that, but I know what I don't want to see our court stand in the way.
Well, you've done a lot, and in a moment I'll get to one more thing that you've done. But before then, we've been rudely interrupted here in the San Francisco courthouse.
Oh, it's my brother. My brother. He was 3 years old. I was 3 years old when he was born. So it's my younger brother.
That would be Charles Breyer. I clerked for Judge Breyer before I clerked for Justice Breyer. I'll give you one guess how I got the job with Justice Breyer. Okay. And he's now my colleague down the hall here in the district court.
And very fortunate to have Judge Chhabria.
Yeah, it's nice. Good. Very nice to see you. Great. How are your goldfish? Yes, the greatest goldfish.
Thank you very much. Maybe better than I am in this pandemic.
Oh, God.
All right. Well, that is not the only special guest we have actually today. We talked about the Seattle schools case. You have not just talked the talk when it comes to the issue of diversity. You have had a longstanding commitment since you first became a judge to hire a diverse array of law clerks. And I mentioned the law clerk reunion we had last year. We took a picture of the whole group, and it was striking how much that group looked like America. That's something that it's become more popular now to focus on diversity in law clerk hiring. It's something that you've done since the very beginning. And, of course, when you are hiring a law clerk, especially to be a law clerk for you at the Supreme Court, you're doing two things. You're bringing them into your inner circle, which is a very big deal. But and by doing that, you're also opening these vast doors of opportunity for these people to go on and participate in our democracy in the way you've been talking about. And so I thought I might bring a few of those people in, a few of your former law clerks, sort of a "this is your life" type of thing. The first person I want to bring in is he clerked a couple of years after me, and he has since argued before you 15 times at the Supreme Court, both in his capacity in the Solicitor General's office and as the head of the Supreme Court practice at Aiken Gump. Pratik Shah, can we bring Pratik Shah in? There he is.
Where? There he is. How are you, Pratik? How are you?
Good. Hi, Justice. How are you?
Fine. Are you out in California right this minute?
No, we're in DC, so we are in Bethesda's. We just actually moved into a new place this weekend, so good. We're holed up here in Bethesda now.
Good. And your
anything you want to share with us, Pratik?
Yes. Well, your conversation reminded me of the first time that we met, which I doubt you'd recall, Justice, but it actually wasn't when I first interviewed for the clerkship. Rather, it was just after I'd finished my 1L year when I was a summer extern for your brother in San Francisco. Vince happened to be his law clerk at the time, and they had asked me to draft a memo on some constitutional issue, despite the fact that I had not yet taken constitutional law. And unbeknownst to me, you were visiting your brother's chambers that summer. And your brother and Vince arranged to call me into his office where, much to my shock, you were sitting with a copy of my memo in hand. And I vividly recall your brother, Judge Breyer, saying he hadn't had a chance to study the memo yet, but that you had done so and wanted to ask me some questions. And that was pretty much my last memory of that morning, because I must have blacked out at that prospect as just a 1L student. But I think of that fondly still as my first true oral argument. And I share that story because I think it speaks to the importance of mentors. Without Vince helping to put me in that position, and without you engaging me in that opportunity, I would have missed out on what is truly a formative experience for me, and one that gave me the confidence to later pursue a clerkship with you and to argue in front of the Supreme Court for a living. So it's just a small window into all you've done for me personally, and I know for many other young lawyers of color.
Oh, you did a lot for me when you were clerking there, so it's not even.
Well, I'm glad you think so.
Our next guest, and hopefully Pratik, you can stay on with us. Our next guest is the Deputy Legal Director of the National ACLU. And fortunately, the ACLU doesn't have too much going on right now. They're not very busy. And so Cecilia Wong has been able to take a few minutes to join us. Maybe we can bring Cecilia in.
Hello, Cecilia.
Hello, Justice Breyer. Hello, Judge Chhabria and Pratik. Nice to see you all.
But you are in San Francisco.
I am in San Francisco. That's right. Always. Well, at least since COVID times.
Yeah.
So thank you for inviting me. Judge Chhabria invited me to reflect personally. And so I guess I would start by saying that I came to my clerkship year suffering terribly from imposter syndrome. I was only 26 years old. I'm the daughter of immigrants, and I didn't know a single lawyer until the summer before I started law school. So honestly, I was very nervous to find myself clerking at the court. I felt like I was learning to swim in the middle of the ocean.
Okay.
And it was truly a lifeline to find out, Justice, that you had built a community in your chambers that reflected diverse viewpoints, where there were co-clerks coming from all different backgrounds. And even more important, that you recognized that each of us sometimes was bringing the hopes of an entire family and an entire community on our shoulders when we came to that clerkship year. And I appreciate so much that you supported each of us, not just as your clerks, but as full human beings, coming to the job with everything that we carried, all the hopes and worries and all the effort to do the best job we could.
Whatever you did.
Yeah.
It was nice. It's nice for me.
Yeah, we helped each other through that year. It's a tough year. It's hard work. And you really launched all of our careers. And I know that I really experienced the fact that you are by vocation a teacher before you were a judge. And I think that all of us have taken all of those lessons of how to nurture the next generation of young lawyers that we are now mentoring and launching into their own careers. So 23 years later, after my clerkship year, I'm still really treasuring the gift from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have next, we have the Dean of Stanford Law School, Jenny Martinez.
Hi, Jenny.
Hello.
I'm afraid you go stay over in The Hague and never come back.
I was just telling my students that you and your interest in international law and comparative law were part of what inspired me to go over to The Hague. But what I was planning to say was how much I appreciate that your pragmatic approach to law takes into account the diversity of people in the United States and also, as I just said, around the world. But everybody who's clerked for you knows that one of the things you hear most often is it practical? Would this interpretation of the law make sense to ordinary people? And one of the things that is really wonderful about the way you think about ordinary people is you recognize that they come in all different colors and backgrounds, and that the ordinary people in America have very different lives, and that when we think about whether the law makes sense to ordinary people, whether this interpretation is something that you could explain practically to someone on the street, you have all those different kinds of people in mind, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you just have to deal with the faculty.
Yes, I do.
You have to be practical. You have to be very practical.
You do have to be very practical. Yeah.
Let's see. The next person is the first, I believe, the first Breyer clerk to be appointed to the federal bench, Judge Katanji Brown Jackson, on the district court for the District of Columbia. Katanji, you out there?
Hello.
Hello, Katanji.
How are you? Well, thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to say how wonderful it is to be here and to reflect on the fact that as a Black woman lawyer, I have often experienced being the first in various workplace and professional settings. So one of the things that I appreciated the most when I interviewed for the Justice Breyer clerkship was realizing that I would not be the first Black woman that he had ever hired as a law clerk, and that he was truly committed to seeking out diverse and talented assistants. And of course, my clerkship was a really great example because I clerked alongside Tim Wu. And we had a fantastic time together sharing an office. And I also saw at the time that we all came back to the court how dynamic and diverse and vibrant the law clerk class was, or the law clerk group during our reunion. And how I felt once again how grateful I was not to be the only person of color in that setting. And I thought and continue to think that Justice Breyer has made his convictions about the importance of equality real, not only in his rulings, but also in his hiring practices. And as a descendant of slaves, let me just say that, Justice, your thoughtfulness in that regard has made a world of difference. It's opened doors of opportunities that my forebearers, up to and including my grandparents, would not have even dared to dream of. So thank you very much.
We got on because your father and my father were both lawyers for school boards.
That is true. That is true.
And also, you went to the Sentencing Commission.
Correct.
Which is a punishment. But you survived it.
I did. It was wonderful. Thank you.
The next, our next visitor, I don't really know how to introduce him anymore. It's become sort of difficult to, I guess what I will say is former Solicitor General and current juggernaut, Neil Katyal.
Hi, Justice. How are you?
Hi, Neil. How are you?
Great.
Very nice to see you.
So I think I'm supposed to talk a bit about diversity in clerkships. I think when you walk into your chambers and you just see the photos, you notice something. Frankly, it looks pretty different than the other chambers. You see a lot of Black and brown faces, and you also see a remarkable number of women. And I remember I asked you about this, and you said that was by design, and you always had at least half of your clerks women, starting in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. And that's been a hugely important lesson to all of us. About what's right, and it's created a force multiplier effect because your clerks go out and adopt those practices themselves. My practice has always had, I've always hired half women at least because of the example you set, and minorities and the like. And I remember when I came into the Solicitor General's office, there were only 3 of the 16 line attorneys were women, and through attrition we got it up to almost half before I left. And I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't set that example. And it's intrinsically right, and it's right for the profession. And, I and so many others are so grateful to you for paving the way for us.
Thank you.
You know, it dawns on me as I look at this group. Seems like we're starting to build
Great to
a
see
pretty
you.
good Supreme Court here.
Yeah, right. But you only have 7. 6,
Yeah.
actually. 6, really. Need a few more.
Katanji, you mentioned Tim Wu. Tim is here also, the father of net neutrality. Can we bring Tim in?
There he is. There he is. The net neutrality almost.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
How are you?
Almost Lieutenant Governor of New York. And a few more of the voters.
Tried my best.
Right. Very good. He got on well with Katanji because he worked all night and she worked all day. And
That's true.
Tim did
That's
make
absolutely
2 mistakes.
true.
Right. And one mistake was he wanted to order Krispy Kreme donuts from some kind of a shop nearby that would only order them if they said they were purveyors of Krispy Kreme donuts to the Supreme Court. That worked well for a while.
You know, can I say something? That company was the predecessor to Amazon. They just weren't very successful. They said they would deliver anything from any store to you. Well, they failed pretty soon afterwards.
Well,
they had no delivery fee. Cosmo.com, that's what they were called. And they would deliver anything to you for free. That was their business model. And they went out of business in a year.
That's surprising.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I think this is a good illustration of, part of the legacy that you are leaving, Justice Breyer. We are very proud to have worked with you and very proud to have you as a mentor. And it's a lot of fun to see all these folks go off and do all the great things that they're doing.
Of course, what you don't know, because it sounds phony, but it's true, is the clerks are the great benefit of working in the Supreme Court. It's always fun to see them. It always brings you back. And you're talking about diversity. That's not an effort. It's certainly not an effort in the last couple of decades. I mean, maybe it was 30 years ago or 25 years ago, and you had to really sort of make yourself credible with different groups and search around. But it's not. So you say, thank you for doing that. No. Why should you? I'm the one. I mean, all the emotions that go through my mind. And so it's in Shakespeare, Henry IV, I can't remember which part. I think it's the first part, but I'm not sure. Maybe is Falstaff, who has a friend who's a judge, and he's quite old, and he's sitting there having a cup of tea or something in the afternoon with his friend who was a lawyer who they've known for 40 years, and they're thinking about when they started practicing or when they were in law school, and the judge says, "Those were the days." Indeed. You see, there we are. So thank you very, very, very much. And thank you, Vince, for organizing this.